Over the past 3 years that I've spent writing and recording story times, one of the most common things that I've discussed is church. Whether it be about attending church itself, attending a church trip like Camp Refuge, or talking about how I was treated by my peers at church. I've gone into great detail about my experience growing up in church and talking about both the good and not so good parts about it. However, if you've seen any story times regarding the bad parts about church, particularly Storytime 49 or the ERS series, then you know that they greatly overshadowed the good parts. So much in fact that they ultimately caused me to develop religious trauma and resulted in me deconstructing during the summer of 2023. So for this story time, I figured that I would discuss my deconstruction journey, how I survived and continue to survive religious trauma, and just how much I've grown as a result of this issue. I'm Zach, and this is Storytime 58 on February 2nd, 2024. So before I begin, I first want to provide a little disclaimer. This storytime will be discussing some very serious topics. Religion is pretty much the focal point of the storytime, but even more than that, I'll also be criticizing it immensely, specifically evangelical Christianity. Additionally, I will be discussing serious mental health issues like depression, anxiety, religious trauma, and more. So if you are very prone to serious topics like these, then I would advise you to click off this video, as unlike my other story times that are lighthearted and humorous, this story time will be for the most part very serious. Now, how this story time will be structured is that I'm first going to talk about what deconstruction and religious trauma are, explain the differences between the two, and talk about why people experience these things and also Christian responses to them. Afterwards, I'm going to basically give a rundown of how I grew up in church, specifically my denomination, and talk about some of its beliefs that makes it different from other Christian denominations. Then I'm going to get into more of my history with religious trauma, basically summarizing the events that caused me to develop the trauma and how it eventually led to deconstructing. Then at the end of the story time, I talk about the particular things that I've deconstructed, why I deconstructed those things, and what I believe now. Alright, so what is deconstruction? So deconstruction is basically the action of critically examining one's religious or cultural beliefs and questioning them, often resulting in one who is deconstructing to turn away from their religion or culture. However, deconstruction doesn't have to involve an entire religion, as it can also be parts of that religion, as is the case for me. So these might be specific beliefs of a religion, certain practices, or just a specific denomination if it's of a religion, if that's the religion being deconstructed as Christianity. Deconstruction can be kind of confusing since it can mean a broad range of things, but hopefully by the end of the story time, you'll get a good grasp of it and basic understanding of what it can entail. Now, do not mistake deconstruction with religious trauma, as they are not the same. However, religious trauma can often lead to deconstructing. Anyways, religious trauma is, as the name says, trauma caused by religion, whether it be things that members of a religion say or actions by members of the religion, usually both of which are the cases we're going to see with me. Religious trauma is also a very broad topic, as it could be a vast multitude of things. It could be things like the fear of being left behind by the rapture or nervousness around someone of the opposite gender because of strict purity culture beliefs, or really anything related to religion. Again, it's a very broad issue that can really be anything related to religion. Now, what do churches say about these topics? Well, many churches unfortunately try to cover up these issues and ignore them and use shallow responses such as, those people just want to live in sin, or those people were never real Christians, or even they aren't praying enough, often ignoring the real reasons behind the issues and instead choosing to villainize the victims, somewhat similar to what cults do. You'll see a lot of similarities between my old church and a cult, and understand why I consider my old church to be a cult. Additionally, mental health and self-care is generally not prioritized much in evangelical churches, as most evangelical churches equate mental health issues to spiritual issues, which is why they often will say things like, you're depressed because you're not praying enough, or God will fix it. Also, when presented with questions that those who are deconstructing ask, the church will often give a vague and nonsensical response like, you just need to have faith, or even blame the one who asking the questions for questioning God. So that's a little bit of background on what religious trauma and deconstruction are, as well as how churches often respond to these topics. Now let's shift the focus over towards the specific church denomination I grew up in and talk about some of its beliefs. So I grew up in churches affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention, or the SBC as I'll refer to it as. The SBC is the organization that oversees the Southern Baptist denomination, a branch of evangelical Christianity. I'll use SBC, the Southern Baptist denomination, and evangelicals interchangeably throughout the story time. Anyways, you'll come to know that every single Christian denomination believes the same big topics. those being that Jesus created us, the earth, and everything, and that he sent his son Jesus Christ to die on the cross to save us from our sins. This is a universal belief that's between Southern Baptists, Catholics, Presbyterians, and every other branch of Christianity, since it's the religion's core foundation. However, the reason that there are different denominations is because each denomination has different interpretations and beliefs regarding smaller stuff on things like the end times, creationism, and even the validity of the Bible. As for the SBC itself, it is the most popular denomination in the United States, and unfortunately is what most people usually think of when they think of church. It's known for having very rigid fundamentalist beliefs. They will often claim that the Bible is 100% the Word of God, and they say that everything in the Bible is 100% true, and if even one thing is false, the whole religion is wrong. Now, like the other evangelical denominations, the SBC is also known for holding conservative beliefs, including but not limited to their opposition of homosexuality, opposition to female pastors or other female leaders, and ties to the Republican Party and support for conservative political candidates. As you all know, I do not like to bring up politics in Storytime, as I myself hate political discussions and issues since I tend to be neutral on most political topics. Therefore, I'm not going to bring up any political issues or anything like that in the story time, and instead strictly focus on religious and spiritual issues. So that's kind of a general overview of the SBC and some of their beliefs. Of course, like every other denomination, they believe the key points of Christianity, but they all have their smaller differences regarding beliefs and worship structure that make them much more different from other denominations. However, as we're going to see throughout the story time, the SBC has a habit of putting far more focus into these small things and even using them to construct a sanctuary for hate, divisiveness, and abuse, which is ironically what Jesus preached against. So, now that you all are updated on what the SBC is and what it believes, I can now begin discussing my history with the SBC and how I eventually turned away from it and began deconstructing. So as said at the beginning of the story time, I grew up in church. My family on both sides were and still are strong Southern Baptist. In fact, as of the time of me recording this story time, I'm the only non-Southern Baptist on both sides of my family. Therefore, you can kind of see how the culture was very levied on me and see how it played out. Anyways, as for the church specifically, my family kind of switched churches a couple of times. From the time I was born to when I was 10 years old, I and the rest of my family attended a mega church about 35 minutes from where we lived. It was the church that Mom grew up in and where her side of the family went to church. It's a massive church that seems to always be under construction, as it just keeps expanding. The church is so big that it has a full-on campus, with the sanctuary and Sunday school groups being on one side of the road and the giant youth building being on the other side. The worship center itself was also spectacular, with a huge stage, baptism area, a balcony, and even seats to fill over 2,000 people. And this church had 3 services every Sunday. Additionally, each Sunday school group often had 2 or 3 classes per grade, and for us kids, since there were so many of us, as it was that big of a church. Now, as for the preacher, I don't really remember much about him, so I can't really say anything about his teaching or his beliefs. I do know that he got pretty loud at times, and like any Baptist pastor, you'll come to find that he liked to, damn, this sentence was absolutely horribly written. I do not know that he got pretty loud at times like any Baptist. I do know that he got pretty loud at times like any Baptist pastor, which you'll come to find, there we go, but which you'll come to find that Baptist pastors love yelling at their congregations for some reason. But again, I can't really say anything about him since it's been almost a decade since we left his church. However, I do remember the things I did with the church as a kid. Sunday school would be the main one, where once we were done with the worship service, Dad would walk me over to my classroom while Mom walked my little sister Zoe to hers. I never made any friends at this church, as I didn't even make my first friend until I was 9 years old, nor did I speak my first word until I was 3 years old. I'm on the autism spectrum, which I went into very in-depth detail about in Storytime 50, but pretty much that makes me very awkward around people and results in me having different social cues than neurotypicals. Unfortunately, you'll come to find that evangelicals are not exactly the most supportive of us autistic and other neurodivergent people. In fact, some extremists and evangelicals have even gone as far as to claim that autism is caused by demons. I wish I was making that up, but Pastor Greg Locke, an extremist celebrity pastor of a Nashville megachurch that many evangelicals look up for, once said that in a sermon as well as some other insane stuff. I'll attach a link to an article about it in the description in case you want to lose your brain cells trying to comprehend that piece of shit's explanation. Now, in addition to Sunday school, Me and Zoe also attended a program on Wednesday nights called Awanas, which is basically a program from kindergarten to 5th grade where we would report to church, be assigned classes, and have to memorize Bible verses. We would work through a booklet that includes 2 verses per page, and the goal was for each week, we would have these 2 verses memorized so that our Awanas leader could sign them off and you could be given shares, which is like an Awana currency that you can spend at the end of the school year on some toys, candy, and even occasionally video games. So kind of like an arcade but memorizing Bible verses. And I have to be honest, Awanas fulfilled its mission pretty well, as the vast amount of Bible knowledge I have today actually stems all the way back from this program. Sure, I can't memorize most verses that I memorized back in the day, although I could still remember the big ones like John 3:16 and Genesis 1:1, but I still recall the vast amount of Bible stories and lessons from doing Awanas and memorizing scripture. It also had the same effect on Zoe, who also got a good grasp of Bible knowledge from this program. It also taught us how to read the Bible and use it, as part of the program was memorizing all 66 books of the Bible in order from the 39 Old Testament books to the 27 New Testament books. And yes, I still to this day have all the books memorized in order, so if I end up meeting some cute Christian girl one day, I could maybe recite the books in order to impress her since I'm not really the best at picking up chairs. But memorizing verses wasn't all that we did at Awanas. We also played games and were given a sermon by the kids' pastor. By the way, the kids' pastor was a fucking asshole, often picking on kids who didn't really want to be picked on and was just super flamboyant and irritating to be around. I myself was picked on quite a bit by him since I was the quiet kid, which made me really hate that guy, and even though it's been almost a decade since I've last seen or even heard from him, I hate his guts for that shit that he pulled back when I was a kid. Now, I should mention that we were also paired into groups, which were who we hung out with, sat with during Bible studies, and played during games. Our groups were based on our grade and gender, so there would be 2 groups for each grade, one for the boys and one for the girls. Each group was led by an Awanas leader. I ended up having the same Awanas leader for all the way until I stopped doing it, as he stuck with us until 5th grade. He was very similar to me, not too energetic and overall pretty chill guy, but he was still really like me and the rest of the group, so that's why he stayed with us for all those years. Now, Awanas was only during the Sunday school year, so during summer, we didn't have any Wednesday night programs. However, there would be one week in mid-July reserved for Vacation Bible School, or VBS as I will be referring to it throughout the story time. Almost every church in the country does a VBS for their kids, and I've also done a whole story time about VBS in the form of Storytime 39. But basically, VBS is a week-long event that churches do in the summer for kids from kindergarten through 5th grade. Throughout the week, kids learn about God through both scripture and Bible studies to singing and dancing. Singing and dancing were by far my least favorite parts about VBS, as I've never been one for those 2 activities. The large crowds and loud music were also big icks I had with VBS. Now, the way VBS works is that at the beginning of the day, kids attend big worship sessions with all the other attendees in the sanctuary for what I refer to as big-ass sessions back in Storytime 39, so I'll continue to use that terminology in this story time. Big-ass sessions consisted of dancing and singing the songs learned in the music station, which I'll get to in a bit, as well as the preacher of the church giving an introduction and hyping the kids up for the day. Afterwards, kids are dismissed with their groups to go to different stations. These stations included but were not limited to Bible study, crafts, rec, music, and my personal favorite, snacks. So that's how VBS worked. Every church does VBS differently, as some churches do VBS from Monday through Friday, while some churches might do VBS at night or even use different themes. So while there's a VBS organization that creates the songs and dances, plans out the decorations, and Bible verses, churches are pretty much left with all the other decisions like what to serve for snacks or what songs they want to do or even what time they want to hold VBS. Now, you'll come to know that I dreaded VBS week every summer. Pretty much since kindergarten, I hated VBS because of how loud and crowded it was, which caused me as an autistic kid to stimulate quite a bit. Even now as an adult, I still get really nervous in large crowds or loud environments, which is why I don't ever go to parties, concerts, or any huge social events, as well as why I tend to shake rapidly or bite my fingernails when in loud or crowded areas. However, you'll come to know that as a kid, I never expressed my thoughts about VBS to my parents or anyone because I literally thought it was a sin to not enjoy church and other church events. I can't remember exactly where I heard that, but I know it was either a sermon or a Sunday school lesson that I was told that not liking church-related stuff was sinful and worldly. Yeah, the SVC really tries to indoctrinate and control kids' own thoughts. That's how cultish it is. I thankfully grew out of this mindset even way before I started deconstructing, but I'd still feel guilty for not liking a Christian song or not wanting to be at church. In fact, I was even told in Sunday school one time that making non-Christian music would send us to hell because we're not glorifying God. Believe me, I had a billion nightmares about being sent to hell for accidentally coming up with a non-Christian song in my head. Speaking of which, hell was talked about all the time at all 3 Southern Baptist churches I went to, and would be one of the key reasons I started deconstructing. The goal of Christianity is to create disciples and turn them towards God so that they could spend eternity in heaven. But that's not the goal of SBC pastors, it seems, as it's almost as if they want people to go to hell, given how they talk about all the different types of people who are going to hell. Literally, whenever I see Christians at college holding up signs, those signs almost never preach the grace of God, and instead talk about how hell awaits for sinners. In fact, one man who comes by my college every semester holds up a sign by the student union that lists groups of people who are going to hell. That list includes a multitude of things you'd expect an SBC street preacher to mention, like homosexuals, transgenders, non-Christians, anyone who has sex outside marriage, and anyone who watches porn. But they also include some completely ridiculous ones like Catholics, Methodists, and other progressive Christians, as well as even quote-unquote disobedient women, aka women who turn away from their abusive husbands. It's ironic because the man who held up this sign actually had to pay $3 million from a legal lawsuit, and one of the groups of people his sign said that were going to hell were liars. You can't make this shit up. And this man and these other hell awaits type preachers are almost all SBC affiliated and sponsored by the SBC. And then the SBC is surprised that nobody wants to go to church anymore. Just fucking ridiculous. That only proves my point that the SBC is a cult, since SBC preachers would much rather talk about how the people they don't like are going to hell, rather than trying to help them and turn them towards God. Anyways, other than what the church taught and indoctrinated me with, it usually wasn't too bad. Of course, I didn't have any friends, so I just went to Sunday school and Awanas on Wednesday nights, as well as VBS during the summer. However, there was one issue I had with this church, minus the indoctrination. So from kindergarten all the way until we left this church, I was physically picked on by 2 boys. Every day at Sunday school, Awanas, and at VBS, they would physically beat me, whether it be by punching, kicking, or slapping me. As a kid, I almost always had at least one bruise on my body just because of these 2 boys and how much they picked on me. Now, you might be wondering why I didn't just tell an adult about this. Well, the issue is that these 2 boys' dad was a deacon. Church leaders and their families at this church were pretty much held on a pedestal and viewed as who we should look up to. So everyone viewed these boys and their family as perfect and would do whatever it meant to spoil them. So if I was to talk to an adult, they would immediately play it off and say that they were just playing, even though I did not want to play with them and was literally receiving bruises. Of course, had I done the same thing or fought back, I would have been disciplined to the highest degree and would have been thought of as a devil child. It wouldn't be until I had already finished 5th grade when this situation was resolved, as during VBS, a chaperone who did not attend our church regularly noticed them beating me and took action, not knowing that they were the deacon's kids and I was just a nobody. The boys who had never been told no before were really scared and ran away like the little cowards they were. I don't remember who or what that woman would even look like, but I still have immense respect for her and will forever. So that's pretty much all that happened at the church I spent the first 10 years of my life going to. So let's jump a little bit to August 2014. So our church, in an effort to expand, decided to plant a satellite church in a city much closer to where we lived. So of course, being closer, my parents decided that we would start attending it for Sunday morning worship. Me and Zoe would still do Awanas with the main church for the remainder of 2014, and in January of 2015, but we would stop attending in February. Anyways, this satellite church was way smaller than the main church. There were only 75 members total at this church, and about 50 of those members were over the age of 65. Like my dad, who was 43 at the time of joining the satellite church, was literally one of the youngest adults at the church. And as you can expect, there were also very few kids at this church. In fact, me and Zoe were the only kids our age at the church, as the other kids were either babies, toddlers, or older than me. Me and Zoe are also the only public school kids at this church too, as everyone else was either homeschooled or enrolled in a private school, since our church was one of those that very strongly disapproved of public school. But that isn't to say that this church was completely terrible. With it being small, everyone knew each other and it was pretty easy to get along with others. Unlike the main church, this church didn't really have a hierarchy and everyone respected each other, so it was a lot better than my old church in that sense. It was also of course closer too, so we didn't have to drive 35 minutes each way just to go to church. And of course those dipshits who picked on me didn't attend this church, so that meant that I got away from them, which also felt great. And overall, this church wasn't so bad. There wasn't as much indoctrination as you might think, especially with this being a homeschool-heavy church. In fact, I don't recall our preacher or anyone in Sunday school saying anything completely ridiculous. Me and Zoe both attended Sunday school with Dad since there wasn't a kids' Sunday school for those past kindergarten, since there were so few kids who attended this church. Mom was the Sunday school teacher for the preschoolers and kindergartners. And honestly, I can't really comment much else regarding this church. Of the 3 SBC churches that I attended, this is probably the best one, just because there was never really anything that happened, and it was really tame for the most part. However, it was also the most boring of the 3 because, well, there wasn't really anything for me and Zoe since we were both outliers in the church, as we were public school kids and were not in the same age group as everyone else. This proved to be a big issue during the summer of 2015. So that June, I wrapped up 5th grade, meaning I was done with elementary school. Normally after 5th grade, students would go on to the district's middle school for 6th through 8th grade. However, the middle school was in the middle of nowhere and in the complete opposite direction of where my parents worked. So my parents instead enrolled me into another district that was much closer to where they worked. However, this district had an intermediate school for 5th and 6th grade, so I would go there for a year and then attend the middle school for 7th and 8th grade. However, because this was a completely different district, that meant that I was starting at a school where I knew absolutely nobody. And since everyone else already knew each other from 5th grade, that only made it more difficult for me since I was the only one in that position. Therefore, Mom would place me in a multitude of church events during the summer of 2015 to get me to meet others who also went to church. This involved me having to do 3 VBSs that summer and a church camp. One VBS was with the main church that we left that August before. The second VBS was with our church that we were going to, and the third VBS was with the church that we would start going to in 2017. Then the camp was a completely different church. Besides the VBS with our church at the time, which was the one that was at night and more calm, I hated doing all of these. Of course, as mentioned, I despised VBS as a kid, and then the camp ended up being absolutely atrocious. I talked more about my experience at these VBSs in camp in ERS Part 2, so I'm not going to discuss them in this story time. However, I do want to bring up camp because the people who worked at this camp were extremely creepy. And by creepy, I mean that I think that there were a few pedophiles who worked at this camp. One instance was the first morning at camp, being that Monday. I had just finished showering, but my towel was on the other side of the curtain. It was also rather crowded, and I didn't want to just walk out naked in front of everyone. So I got the attention of a man about to take his shower and asked if he could throw my towel over. But instead of throwing my towel over, this fucking pervert opened my shower curtain knowing that I had nothing on, and even though I specifically asked him to throw my towel over the curtain. At the time, I didn't know anything about creeps or even knew what sex was, so while it made me extremely uncomfortable, I didn't think too much of it. It wouldn't be until I was 17 when it clicked that this man was likely a pedophile, which I realized when writing Storytime 41 back in November of 2021. I realized that this man was likely using this opportunity to look at me nude, and I worried that if there wasn't anyone else around, he probably had done something extremely horrifying. There was also a man in the pool who made me extremely uncomfortable when I attended camp, but when I look back on my experience, I realized that this man was also super creepy and a pervert. So how pool time worked was that the girls would do theirs first, and then us boys would have ours after theirs. Anyways, when me and the other boys arrived at the pool, there was a man already in a pool float, and let's just say that this man's appearance was already enough to make him look creepy, as he genuinely looked like a Discord mod. Like he was obese, had a shit ton of chest and facial hair, and he just struck me as creepy right from the get-go. But things only get more strange from there. The pool had a diving board, so me and almost every other boy went over and took turns jumping off of it. However, this man really wanted us to do belly flops for whatever reason, so he would cheer us on and to do a belly flop and would even get mad if we didn't. Already unusual and unacceptable behavior with 9 to 12-year-old boys. But then it was my turn. Of course he cheered me on to do a belly flop, but of course being me, I didn't want to, so I instead chose to dive. But when I reached the surface, I heard him shout, "Y'all are worse than the girls." At the time, this comment didn't really seem to weird me out too much, but looking back on it, that's really fucking weird, as that implies that he was in the pool with the girls, and that seems like a reasonable guess since he was already comfortable in his pool float when we arrived. And of course, given his Discord mod appearance, I think you can guess what kinds of things were likely on this man's computer. Oh, and just to make things really worse, this was the only day we saw him, as he was not at the pool the next day or Wednesday. We were not told what happened to him, but I'd bet my whole savings account that this man was arrested or kicked out of the camp for acting inappropriately with kids. So those are a couple of weird camp workers that made me extremely comfortable during my time at camp. But the reason I bring this up is because these two men became extremely relevant to my trauma during the summer of 2022, when the SBC was discovered to have covered up over 700 sexual abuse allegations, When reading the news articles and reports, I immediately became sick to my stomach, not only from the horrific and disgusting actions that church leaders have done, but also the fact that the allegations reminded me of those two creepy men back from camp 7 years ago, and the fact that the SBC literally tried to cover them up. It also made me mad because the same denomination that pushes purity culture on its members and on government policy were doing the same things that purity culture preaches against, aka sex outside of marriage. I'd also have a run-in with another church leader as a pedophile a few years later, which only further angered me about this whole situation. But you know what absolutely boils my blood? When these allegations came out, the SBC tried to file a friend of the court claim to the court and say that they will investigate the situation themselves. Thankfully, the court rejected this since the same organization covered up 700 sexual abuse allegations, but it just comes to show just how perverted, disgusting, and evil the SBC is. God have fucking mercy. So that's pretty much what happened at camp that caused religious trauma. There was also this really weird kid who wet the bed our first night and also tried to flash his cock at everyone, but I talked about that in ERS Part 2 if you're interested. Anyways, there really isn't much to talk about regarding religious trauma and other issues with church until we switch churches, so I figured that I'd go ahead and talk about that now. So in 2017, my parents began to become increasingly more frustrated with our church. Even though Dad had recently become a deacon, we were still not too happy with church leadership, specifically with the youth pastor. The youth pastor was really sketchy and expected members to do more than they really needed to do and was just a super corrupt guy. Additionally, me and Zoe didn't have any friends and of course didn't go to school with anyone. Zoe was also going to be starting 5th grade in August at the intermediate school, and even though she's never struggled with making friends and she's a lot more outgoing than I am, it was still very stressful for her since it was a new environment for her. Therefore, we as a family decided to start looking at another church, and the church that caught our attention was a mega church that wasn't too far from our church that we went to at the time. Me and Zoe both did VBS with this church during the summer of 2015, one of Mom's efforts to get me and meet others who I'd be going to school with and who also went to church with. She chose this church for me to attend VBS in particular because, of course, being a mega church, that meant that there would be a lot of kids my age who attended the local intermediate school. Of course, if you saw ERS Part 2, you know those efforts were not very effective, since I ended up making friends with kids who didn't go to church that school year like I usually do. In fact, the vast majority of my friends growing up who were real friends, not fakes, were people who either weren't SBC affiliated or not even Christians at all. This went directly against the church's teaching, as they preached social isolation from non-believers and claimed that we should only surround ourselves with other believers, specifically SBC members, so that we wouldn't fall into quote-unquote temptation. You'll come to find that the SBC likes to use the word temptation a lot as a way of controlling its members and maintaining power over them. It might seem like an insignificant word, but you'd be surprised how much the SBC and other religious cults use the word temptation compared to healthy religious groups. I also think it's funny how almost every single fake friend I've ever had who did me extremely dirty was a Southern Baptist, which I'll talk about quite a bit later on. Anyways, getting back on topic, the new church also had a massive youth group with over 50 teens grades 7 through 12, as those are the grades that the church did youth for. They didn't do 6th grade like most other churches since they followed the school district structure, as unlike our previous church, the vast majority of kids at this church were in public school and went to the same school as me and the same school Zoe would be going to, so it'd be a perfect place for us to start attending to meet others who also went to school with us. We would officially start attending this church in May of 2017. We wouldn't really do much at it at first, just simply attend morning worship services. Me and the rest of the family really liked this church. I was particularly a fan of the preacher, who's known for going back to the original Greek and Hebrew translations of the Bible and talking about word meanings. However, this would be exactly what led to me deconstructing 6 years later when I would do this technique myself with some verses and discovered that the preacher not only used this technique when it benefited him and his views, which I'll get to later. Then in July of 2017, we would start to attend Sunday school. I would begin going to youth for Sunday school, and I was quickly met with open arms. The youth pastor welcomed me into the youth group and introduced me to the other boys in my grade, who all also became really close with me and befriended me very quickly. These boys, while nice at first, would eventually reveal that they were wearing a facade the whole time, which would be when my religious trauma really started and be the moment when I began to think negatively of the church. I'll talk about when they did that in a little bit. But in the meantime, they were my friends, and they would play an extremely crucial role during the following school year, that being my 8th grade school year, which I'll get to in a bit. Anyways, back to church, I would also begin going to church on Wednesday nights, as youth took place on both Sundays and Wednesdays. Sundays would also have Sunday school, where we would split up with our grade, and then Wednesday night would consist of all the youth members together while our youth pastor gave a message. so that's how the later portions of the summer of 2017 worked. Overall, the summer was pretty nice and quite a lot happened. However, the following school year would prove to not only be the hardest school year of my entire academic career, but also my most important. That would of course be my 8th grade school year. So much shit happened this year that ERS Part 4 ended up being over 5 hours long. However, for this story time, I am not going to go into full detail about the school year, but rather mention what's applicable to the topic of the story time. Anyways, there are a multitude of reasons as to why 8th grade was such a difficult school year. For one, the classes I was taking were some of the hardest classes I've ever taken. So because of my academic success in 7th grade, with me making the highest grade in 3 of my classes and making the highest grade on the math end-of-year exam in the entire school, my school wanted to challenge me by having me take some high school classes. It also helped that a new law was passed that summer letting autistic students take advanced classes, which is why I had not been placed in advanced classes before despite having higher grades than most students in advanced classes. As for the advanced classes, I took 2 accelerated middle school classes and 3 high school classes. Accelerated English and Science were my 2 middle school classes. Pretty much they were the same as normal 8th grade English and Science, but went a little more in depth. Additionally, Science was only a semester-long class, taking place during the spring 2018 semester. The reason is because during the fall 2017 semester, we took World History, one of our 3 high school classes. Honestly, this class wasn't anything too special, as it was probably the easiest class I took this semester, given that I ended up making the highest grade in the class. However, the other 2 high school classes were a lot more difficult. Let's start by discussing Earth Environmental Science. So this was an interesting class because it was completely online, so I had to do it on the side. It wasn't required for us, but we had to opt in to take it, which I did only because had I not, my parents likely would have thrown a fit about it. But anyways, this class's material wasn't difficult. It was just the labs and that were hard. We had to do these labs ourselves, and holy fuck they were obnoxious. First, just getting the materials was bad enough, especially since we had to get them ourselves. If this is a college course, that would have been easy, but this class was being taught to 8th graders. We didn't have cars, so we couldn't drive to the store or buy goods since we also didn't have money. So I had to ask my parents to buy stuff and could only get materials when they bought things, which was extremely inconvenient and often meant that I was behind on labs. But by far the toughest class I took was Algebra 1, a high school class. This meant that I literally skipped 8th grade math, which is a huge issue because 8th grade math is pre-algebra, which makes this class much easier for students. But since I skipped 8th grade math, well, I was at a huge disadvantage. It also didn't help that everyone else who had previously taken accelerated 7th grade math already knew what was going on since they covered 8th grade math topics in that class, so I was really far behind in this class. And needless to say, this would go on to be the hardest class I've ever taken throughout my academic career. Like, I'm graduating from college in a couple of months with a very difficult major and a very difficult minor, accounting and economics respectively. I've taken 3 intermediate accounting classes and econometrics, and none of these classes were as hard as Algebra 1. This class was absolutely brutal just because I skipped 8th grade math. We also had a fuck ton of homework too, and even though the homework kept me up past my bedtime almost every night, which was 9:45, it was still vital to my success in this class since it allowed me to practice the material. Now, the classes weren't the only difficult thing this school year, as I also was not getting along with my fellow classmates, so I shared all my classes with bullies. These bullies would pick on me and pretty much make me feel really bad about myself. By far the place they did it the most was during lunch, so my school had an incredibly bullshit rule that you can only sit with those in your second block. This rule was imposed so that students wouldn't be left out or sitting at a table by themselves, but as it turns out, this rule ended up making things far worse. Anyways, my second block, being English, had 4 tables assigned to us that we sat at. 2 tables were reserved for the popular girls, 1 was reserved for a group of friends, and the other was where the bullies sat. None of the tables would let me sit with them besides the bullies' table, so that's where I sat. Here, I would endure their bullshit almost every day, from being made fun of to being insulted to being laughed at to a whole multitude of other stuff. It sucked immensely, and I always dreaded lunch every day. But what made it even worse is that I was forced to sit here. I literally couldn't sit anywhere else besides silent lunch, which I did often to not sit with the bullies. But I couldn't go there too much since it was reserved more for punishment, and I didn't want to make myself look suspicious. A third issue this school year had also involved bullying, but it was online, aka cyberbullying. So at this point, I had been doing YouTube for over a year. However, it would be around this time that when I decided that I want to start interacting more with my subscribers, especially since I had to tune down my uploading due to school. That's when I discovered Google+. Most of y'all probably might not know much about this website since it was discontinued in early 2019, but it basically was Google's form of social media. It was pretty much just like Reddit, where there were multiple communities that you could be part of. I used this platform to interact with my subscribers and fellow Demomin players, as it was the place we used to interact. By the way, Demomin was what I mostly uploaded on YouTube from 2016 to 2018. If you've been around my channel for long enough, you know exactly what I'm talking about. However, even though this community is small, it's incredibly toxic. And unfortunately, because 13-year-old me didn't quite have the maturity or the mental stability that 19-year-old me has now, I got involved in a whole lot of this drama. Most of it being on stuff that I really didn't need to be involved in, but I still continued to be involved in it, and it was brutal. Consistent flaming and constant arguing with others took a massive toll on my overall stability and well-being, especially since it would often take the place of doing things I enjoyed like playing video games or writing. So all three of these things, from my course load and schoolwork to being bullied at school to being bullied online, led to me dealing with depression, which I would begin dealing with in September of 2017. Almost every day from then until March, I felt incredibly bad about myself and pretty much hated myself, thinking that everyone who insulted me and called me names were right and that I was a mistake that everyone needed to be fixed. Now you might be wondering why I bring this up since this story time is about religious trauma. Well, during this time, I would become closer and closer with the boys in my grade at church. They would all help me through this tough phase of my life through encouraging me and basically being buddies with me. One of the main places they did this was in middle school boys' small group. So every Monday night, me and about 15 other 7th and 8th grade boys would go to a youth leader's home where we would eat snacks, play games, and have a Bible study. I always looked forward to Monday nights, as it gave me the opportunity to hang out with my friends and play around with them. The youth leader was also cool, being the leader of the group. Well, at least that was until 2 years later when he was arrested for sexting an underage boy, which further depleted my trust in church leaders. Now, over the next few months, even though depression only got worse and worse, I still had my friends to rely on, as they were all very supportive of me and gave me a sense of belonging during this time. However, February of 2018 would be when depression got way worse than it ever had. So one day, the bullies that I was forced to sit with decided that they were going to bully me another way. And by another way, I mean embarrassing me in front of hundreds of students. So the bullies decided that they were going to move to where the popular girls sat. Since while the girls refused to let a kid being bullied to seek refuge at their table, they would let his bully sit with them since they were popular. So that's what they did. The bullies would sit over there, leaving me a table by myself in front of hundreds of students. It's funny how the school implemented this bullshit-ass rule in order for this very thing not to happen, but yet despite what it aimed at doing, it did exactly that. Without this rule, my friends from church could sit with me, but because of the rule, they weren't allowed to. Therefore, I was stuck at a table by myself. I remember the first time they did this. I accidentally brought my pencil with me, which was in my pocket. So I took it out and under the table, I started stabbing myself. This is the moment that I became suicidal. At this point, I believed that had I killed myself, the world would be a much better place. So I stabbed myself for the rest of lunch that day and spent all night that night stabbing myself to the point that my hand had multiple marks and bloodstains on it. I would continue stabbing myself every night for a month, and I'll talk about how I got over harming myself in a bit. But in addition to the stuff happening at school, I was also dealing with other online influences too. Specifically a YouTuber of about 5,000 subscribers who sent me and my friends death threats over drama that happened with a friend of mine and him back in 2014. Yeah, this absolute low-life piece of shit knowingly attacked and sent death threats to kids, the youngest of which was only 11 years old. Yeah, this piece of shit sent death threats to an 11-year-old boy. Absolutely horrendous and disgusting behavior. His channel was thankfully terminated back in the summer of 2019, and since then, he's pretty much been a low-life drunkard with no purpose in life, as if he even had much purpose prior to the termination of his channel. But the death threats were what really drove me crazy, as being told that I would be better off drinking bleach or putting a gun to my head than living really put a huge toll on me, especially since I was already dealing with suicidal and regularly harming myself. So that only drove me even crazier. And then came Thursday, March 8th, 2018, the single worst day of my life. This would be the day that I hit my all-time low, as it was the day that I attempted suicide. Came up with the plan the night before, where I would stab myself with a pencil on various parts of my body throughout the day to make my skin very weak. And then that night, I'd kill myself with a knife. Thankfully, I did not get too far in this attempt. I was lucky enough for my science teacher to notice my unusual behavior that morning, particularly the stab marks on my hand, to which she reported it, and from there, I was able to receive the help that I needed. I'd go on to spend 5 days and 4 nights at the mental hospital, where I would receive a treatment for depression, including an antidepressant prescriptions, and forming close relationship with fellow patients. And as a result, I was able to overcome depression entirely. But while I could go way more in deep depth about the situation, since it's what I consider to be what changed me from a child to an adult, I'm instead going to focus more on my peers, more specifically my peers at church. So to my surprise, everyone was super concerned about me. Since the bullies and the cyberbullies built it into me, I believe that most people would have been happy had I tried to kill myself. But no, as everyone was actually super concerned for me, especially my buddies from church. In fact, every weekday that I was away, they asked our teachers about updates regarding me and asked when I would be returning to school. Additionally, I heard the following Sunday while I was at church, my youth pastor updated everyone on the situation and everyone prayed for me. My non-church peers were also deeply concerned, so it was clear that everyone was really looking out for me. And when I returned from the hospital, I was immediately welcomed by everyone, as everyone, especially my friends from church, were very eager to see me and check up on me. Additionally, I got my classes switched to where I was now sharing my classes with my friends. In fact, on my first day back, all the tables for my new second block were all begging me to sit with them. So it was clear that I really did have a lot of people who cared for me and my well-being. And if y'all are wondering, the bullies, while they did not necessarily become unpopular, they lost a significant amount of their popularity. In fact, they would become more hated than liked after people realized that they did what they did to me and how they treated me. I ended up going to a completely different high school than everyone else, which I'll get to in a bit, so I'm not sure if the bullies were popular in high school or not, but I assume they weren't given how much everyone hated them after the situation unfolded. And this empathy that everyone showed for me would not stop immediately after returning to school, as everyone continued to make sure I was okay throughout the rest of the school year and continued looking out for me to make sure the bullies were not after me. Then in April, I would attend a church event called D Now, a weekend church event where me and other 8th grade boys went to a church leader's home and basically had a 3-day sleepover, where we played games, did volunteer work, and went to the church's campus for big worship sessions with every other D Now group. We didn't do anything too crazy, since both of my arms were broken during this time from an incident unrelated to my suicide attempt, but we still had fun, and it would be at this event where I gave my life to Christ and was baptized a month later on Sunday, May 13th. As for the next couple of months, my peers at church continued to treat me like their own brother and included me in everything they did. However, that June would be when they revealed that all this was actually a facade for their true thoughts of me. And they would show me this at a church trip called Refuge, a 6-day church event held at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee, from Monday, June 18th to Saturday, June 23rd. I'd been excited to attend for a few months, given I was going to be spending a whole week with my peers. They all said they were excited to hang out with me on the trip, and they mentioned that they all had an absolute blast at Refuge the year before, so I was looking forward to it. Now, I went all into detail about my experience at Refuge back in ERS Part 5, so I'm not going to go over everything that happened in the story time, just the parts that relate to religious trauma, since this would be the event that I consider to be when my religious trauma officially started, and would be the event that made me begin questioning and turning away from the church. Much of that started on Monday, June 18th, so after a 7-hour trip to the college, we arrived. We first took group pictures and also learned the dreadful church clap. By the way, fuck the church clap. Dancing for warm-ups back in middle school PE was brutal enough, and so was dancing back in VBS, and I 100% did not need to learn how to dance to this diabolical piece of shit either. But afterwards, it was movement time, so how Refuge works is that attendees get to sleep in the college's dorms. So that's what happened. Because the dorms were traditional style dorms, where we would share a bedroom with another attendee at church and then as a floor share a communal bathroom and showers, we had to pick someone to room with. So that's what happened. Me and everyone else tried to find someone to room with. Everyone was successful except for me, as by the time everyone had a roommate, I was the only one without one. Ironically, some people said that they were excited to room with me prior to Refuge, so I don't know what happened to that sentiment. But this resulted in a big situation for me, since Refuge required us to have a roommate, so my youth pastor stepped up and said I can room with him, which I was cool with. However, a Refuge representative told him that he wasn't allowed to do that. Frustrated, he asked what he was allowed to do, since all the Refuge staff were doing was telling him that he couldn't do with me rather than helping us out. The Refuge staff told him that I could move a mattress into a room already taken, so I would have 2 roommates. The biggest issue is that I would not have my own room key, meaning I would have to be let in every time I exited the room. As I get to in a bit, this would prove to be really bad. Anyways, my youth pastor found a group of 2 rising 8th graders and asked if they were cool with me staying with them, to which they were, so I was able to move my mattress in with them. But while moving in the mattress, my peers passed by me. One of them questioned what I was doing, while the rest of them started laughing at me and making fun of me for being the one left out. Immediately, rage filled through my body as the same motherfuckers who supposedly cared for me during my darkest moments were now treating me just like the bullies did. It was an absolutely awful feeling, being done dirty by the same people who cared for me. It would be this exact moment when my religious trauma really started, and would be when I began thinking negatively of the church. But even worse is that they didn't exclusively make fun of me that day. Because I was without a room key, since they were only 2 per room, I had to wait outside my room and wait for one of my roommates to arrive with the key whenever it was time to go back to our rooms. And during this time, I would be made fun of by my peers for being left out and continue to endure their harassment. Now that begs the question, why did they do this? Well, I have 2 theories as to why. The first and most likely theory is that they disapproved of where I was going for high school. So rather than going to the typical public high school like where everyone else was, I instead chose to go to an early college, a private school where I would receive both a high school diploma and an associate's degree when I graduate. I had to apply to go to this school, to which only about 25% of applicants get in, and I was lucky enough to get accepted. But when I told my peers, they were not excited at all, calling it a waste of time and other stuff. I disregarded their comments, and as a result, I had a fantastic time at the early college, coming out very successful and even still to this day being one of the most well-known alumni of the school. The other theory that isn't as likely but still possible involves the bullies from 8th grade. So even despite knowing what the bullies did to me, my peers at church continue to be friends with them. So my theory is that the bullies told them to do this, which I wouldn't be surprised if they did. So that's another theory too. However, I can't exactly blame them entirely. Sure, my peers were absolutely assholes and low-life pieces of shit for doing this to someone who had just recently overcome mental health issues, but part of the blame also lies on the church. Since I was the only one left out, that meant that they sent an odd number of boys to refuge, despite knowing that the rooms were doubles. Someone should have looked at the roster and realized that this would happen and set up a solution beforehand. But that's not what happened, and because of my church's lack of planning, this shit happened. As a result, I would have an absolutely awful time at Fuge that week, consistently being bullied and made fun of by the same people who helped me overcome depression and suicidal ideology. But by far the worst of it came that Thursday, June 21st. So this is my 14th birthday. I did not make it known to anyone, as I've never been one who likes to celebrate their birthday. However, my mom, unknowing to me at the time, told my youth pastor that Thursday that was my birthday. So he decided to do a couple of surprises that fooled my religious trauma from 0 to 100. That day during our tracks, which were like our mission groups, he announced that it was my birthday and everyone sang happy birthday to me. I let this one slide because nobody from my church was in this track besides my youth pastor, and the track people were all super cool and really nice. However, that night would be when things got extremely awful. So the last thing before we went to bed was church group time, where we as a church gathered into a classroom and did a devotion. However, during this time, my youth pastor got the whole church to sing happy birthday to me. And the people singing happy birthday to me the loudest were none other than the same fuckers who harassed me and made fun of me throughout the week. This further angered me and really made my religious trauma far more extreme than it already was. So that was pretty much my experience at Fuge. Yeah, being left out and harassed for it was absolutely awful, especially since it came from the same people who literally helped me through my darkest moment. If those people aren't the definition of fake friends, I don't know what or who is. And of course, as said, it would be at Fuge when I developed religious trauma. Sure, I did have some specks of trauma as a kid, but it wasn't things that I had thought about consistently. This, on the other hand, is something that even 5.5 years later, I still often think about and sometimes even dream about, even now as someone who no longer attends this church or even this denomination, as being directly attacked by the same people who claim they cared for me has put an eternal sour taste in my mouth for all things church and religion related, and is why I have trust issues with anything SBC related. However, one thing that I grew up being taught in church is to forgive those who did bad to me. This is an incredibly dangerous message that SBC churches teach, since they'll often go out of their way to manipulate scripture in order to force victims of abuse to stay with their abusers and quote-unquote forgive them. Ironically enough, Jesus actually encourages domestic abuse victims to divorce their abusive spouses, but the SBC always pretends that he didn't say that since they're the ones who support abuse. And that's exactly what happened to me with regards to my peers. Because my peers did me wrong, I was instructed by SBC ideology to forgive them and continue to be friends with them. So that's what I attempted to do throughout my 9th grade school year. I tried to stick with them and continue to be friends with them, but they did not prevail and only further degraded me, even doing the same thing to me at a church trip called Winter Retreat that they did at Fuge. So clearly, forgiving them was absolutely zero significance and did not mean shit. And after a little over a year, I realized that they would not ever change and would always be the same assholes that they were at Refuge the year before. So in July of 2019, I decided I was done with their bullshit and officially gave up trying to forgive them or being friends with them. I would also begin to purposely leave myself out of everything and refuse to really talk to anyone. And ironically enough, these absolute fucking idiots actually tried to befriend me and talk to me when I started leaving myself out. Of course, I didn't fall for their bullshit a second time and refused to talk to them, and since then, I have not spoken to any of them since. However, despite cutting them off, I was still immensely hurt from Refuge. Religious trauma only got worse as I got older, especially when I started to think for myself and look at other interpretations of the Bible. My church consistently taught that the Bible was 100% legitimate and that every single word of the Bible was the literal word of God. But over the years, I noticed that our preacher would often criticize translation errors and talk about what they actually mean, implying that maybe not every single word is the word of God. Now let's fast forward to 2022. So that January, I started college. I graduated from early college a semester early, allowing me to enter college at only 17 years old as a junior. However, one thing that really hit me my first semester was that there were so many different beliefs than what I had grown up believing. Growing up, I had been told that the SBC's Bible interpretation was the only correct way to live, and any other way of living was evil and of the devil. But as I progressed through the semester of college, I began to learn about other worldviews and realized that contrary to what my church claimed, they weren't as evil in the slightest. For example, Islam, which wasn't the terrorist or cult that my old church claimed. Sure, there are Islamic extremists such as the masterminds behind 9/11 and many leaders of Middle Eastern governments, but the very vast majority of Muslims are super nice, caring, and they do not shove religion down your throat at all. In fact, Islam is literally called the religion of peace, and from my experience with my Muslim friends, I can absolutely see why, since they're extremely kind and respectful. In fact, they almost never bring up religion since they consider it to be a personal thing. Meanwhile, as a Baptist, I was told to shove religion down everyone's throat and get them to convert to supposedly quote-unquote save them. Then my second semester that fall, I would stop attending church. The semester before, I went home every weekend and attended church with my parents. But since I stopped going home on weekends, I stopped going to church, and I would continue avoiding church the following spring semester. However, the spring semester would be when I started to really despise anything church-related, especially since the summer was coming up and my parents forced me to attend church whenever I was home from college. So throughout the semester, I became ever more scared about having to go back to the same cult that convinced me that continued to wreck my life. And unfortunately, that's what happened that summer. I continued having to attend that church every Sunday. In fact, I would even count down how many church services I had to attend until I could finally go back to school and escape their diabolical bullshit hateful beliefs. Yeah, it was that bad. However, not everything was bad, as this summer would also be when I started to critically examine every aspect of evangelical Christianity. While I continue to believe in Jesus and still to this day consider myself a Christian, I began to critically examine every aspect of the religion and ask myself the tough questions that my church often avoided answering. I especially asked myself questions regarding the church's diversity and culture, one of which was why more introverted people were seen as less valuable than extroverts. I noticed this quite a bit at youth, with of course myself being introverted and having to endure what I did at Refuge, but I also noticed others who weren't very social were often looked down on and viewed as less Christian-like because they weren't as effective at evangelizing. It confuses me further as I read the Bible and noticed that so many of our biblical heroes were introverts. Even Jesus Christ himself was introverted, often excluding himself from society to be alone. Many other heroes too were not very social, such as Moses, who was literally described as a man of few words in Exodus. I also took a good look at my church's overall demographics, and one striking demographic I noticed was the lack of single people. So I continued to pay closer attention to my preacher in Sunday schools, and noticed that singles were often viewed as sinners, and even viewed as being single as a curse. But as I read the Bible, I noticed that many of our heroes were also single. Jesus himself was single, and so was Paul. It then struck me that the reason that singles were viewed as evil by the SBC is that the SBC views marriage and family as an idol, often placing more emphasis on it than even our relationship with Christ, the very thing the religion is based on. I also looked at skin color and questioned why black and white churches even exist. As I looked through the history of the SBC, I was deeply disturbed by some things that this behemoth defended in the past. The SBC was founded in the 1840s in order to manipulate the Bible to defend slavery and support the Confederacy during the American Civil War 20 years later. The SBC would also defend Jim Crow and other racist laws throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, even rebelling against the civil rights movement and antagonizing famous civil rights leaders and supporters. Right after learning about the history, I immediately understood why churches are still segregated, since the SBC continues to be a haven for racism, as I've witnessed throughout my time growing up in an SBC-affiliated church, who often spoke down on non-white groups of people. Considering that these churches are filled with Karens who throw fits when someone speaks Spanish in public, you can see why. I also started to question my church's hatred for the LGBTQ community. Growing up, I was told that gay people were evil sexual perverts trying to groom kids. Additionally, I was taught growing up that having any romantic or sexual feelings for the same gender in of itself was sinful according to Romans 1. But as I looked closer at the verse and just how the SBC treats gay Christians, it just didn't seem right. Jesus preached unity, love, and compassion, and always hung out with sinners and people that the SBC would usually call evil. But yet, this chapter in Romans 1 preached hate. Albeit, it was written by Paul, and considering that guy was an extremist fanatic, you can kind of see why. But when I looked into the original Greek and Hebrew translations and directly translated the verse from those, I found that these verses weren't talking about homosexuals, but rather adult men who sleep with boys. The Bible wasn't condemning homosexuals, it was condemning pedophiles. And given how the SBC has a history of sexual abuse allegations and scandals, I was able to fit the pieces in the puzzle and figure out that the reason my preacher never used the original Greek and Hebrew for this verse was not only because he was homophobic, but because he wanted to cover up the Bible's criticism for pedophiles, which the SBC has had a history of issues with, including a scandal at our own church in January 2020 when my small group leader from 8th grade was arrested for sexting an underage boy. Now, I'm not saying that my preacher was a pedophile himself, since he wasn't, but he did defend abuse and preached hate from the pulpit while covering up issues with the church and ignoring them. It all made sense to me once I made that realization. I knew that I never wanted to do anything with the SBC again, because I had fully realized that the denomination was a cult, which started my deconstruction journey. But right then, I began to ask myself, what next? Now that I realized that the SBC was a cult, I had a multitude of different options. I could leave the religion entirely and become an atheist, I could stay in the cult and continue suffering religious trauma, or I could try to look at another denomination, the latter of which I decided on, so I began looking at other denominations and seeing what the differences were. Growing up, I was pretty much taught that any non-Baptist church taught filth and was filled with the devil. In fact, I remember this being talked about all the time back in Sunday school, where teachers would go on about how evil non-Baptist churches were. The denomination that immediately caught my attention, though, was the United Methodist Church. I was particularly interested in this denomination because my old church would criticize this denomination more than any other denomination, often criticizing it for its more liberal beliefs, ordination of female pastors, and non-literal interpretations of the Bible. I also looked at the Methodist Church history and was very impressed with it, being founded by John and Charles Wesley, both of whom were phenomenal and great men who welcomed all into their church, pitied the poor and other groups looked down upon, and were just really good people. Methodists were also strong supporters of abolition during the time that slavery existed, and were strong supporters of the civil rights movement and supported same-sex marriage, all of which the SBC was strongly against. Therefore, when I returned to college to start my 4th semester, I decided to start attending a Methodist church about 25 minutes from school, and immediately, I was extremely impressed with the church and how they did things. The moment I walked into the church, I knew my old church back at home would strongly disapprove, which made me very happy and comfortable since I've come to realize that whenever my old church disapproves of us, it's probably a good thing. From being LGBTQ affirming to ordaining women pastors to baptizing babies to even advertising mental health resources. I'm sure members of my old church would have a heart attack by what this church had, and I was all for it. Also, this church is a very easy to attend for someone who is deconstructing. Methodists in general are very accepting of anyone or any denomination or religion, and they don't attack anyone for not being Methodist. In fact, they don't even claim that we're the only correct denomination, as my church supports other churches in the area who aren't Methodist, something I would have never seen at my old church. So it's an easy church to go to as someone who's been deeply affected and harmed by religion. As for the congregation, they all welcomed me with open arms, and ever since then, I've been attending this church regularly about every other week. I do not attend Sunday school at the moment, since I right now do not feel ready to attend one given how much trauma I have from my time in Sunday school as a teen. But hopefully one day, I'll be ready to attend a Sunday school and will hopefully be welcomed in, which I'm sure I would, given how welcoming the church is. Now, you might be wondering what my parents think about all this, since they've raised me strictly as a Southern Baptist and of course require me to go to church with them whenever I'm home. Well, surprisingly, they're actually cool with me becoming Methodist and deconstructing. Of course, I'm an adult, so they can't exactly tell me what to do, but they're very accepting of me choosing a different denomination with almost entirely opposite views as them. After all, my parents aren't religious control freaks or super religious or anything like that. They just go to church every Sunday, tithe, and pray before meals. So I'm glad that they accept me for who I am and not what religion I follow, since I've heard many horror stories about Southern Baptist parents going as far as disowning their kids for not being Christians or not even being Baptists. Now, I'm sure the church leaders at my old church would freak the fuck out about where I go to church, but that only assures me that I'm at the right place since they don't have to prove that it's a good thing. My parents have vowed to not tell my youth pastor or anyone else at church where I go to church, and Zoe has vowed not to share too, so I don't have to worry about getting a text message from an unknown number asking why I decided to run towards quote-unquote self-righteousness, or some other blackmailing bullshit abusive churches do. So yeah, that's pretty much my journey through religious trauma and deconstruction. So now that I've discussed that, I think I next want to talk about what all specifics I've deconstructed from my previous evangelical faith and spend some time more exposing the SBC, as you'll kind of know that the Southern Baptist denomination and other evangelical faiths are nothing like what real Christianity is. Probably the biggest thing that I've deconstructed is the Bible's legitimacy. So as mentioned, Baptists claim that the Bible is the literal word of God and every single thing in the Bible is 100% true. However, after reading and questioning it continuously, I've come to find that the Bible is absolutely not God-inspired or God-breathed. The Bible is inherently flawed, with multiple errors and out-of-date teachings. If you need proof, the Bible calls witchcraft a sin and condemns witches, which we all know now in 2024 to be fake since nobody is born with magic. However, I personally believe that the Bible was actually intended to be flawed. You see, the Bible was written by over 40 men over the span of 3,000 years, and one of the biggest things taught in Christianity is that nobody's perfect, which is why we need to rely on God for forgiveness. So making the Bible flawed proves that even some of God's greatest warriors mess up and need God's forgiveness. That's why the Bible isn't really used much in Methodist services as compared to Baptist or other evangelical services. As while we do hold the Bible of being great significance, we don't think the Bible is the literal word of God. I also want to focus on the word literal, too. So evangelicals, as said before, believe that everything in the Bible is 100% legitimate. But as you'll come to find, that is an extremely dangerous ideology, as by claiming that the Bible is literal, that means that evangelicals support way too many out-of-date and even harmful teachings from the Bible. As mentioned earlier with homosexuality, evangelicals are strongly homophobic and condemn homosexuals for simply existing and just living their lives. But as I mentioned earlier, the verse that condemns homosexuality wasn't even supposed to be about homosexuality, but rather about pedophilia. The word homosexuality was only added in the Bible during the 20th century to create bias against the LGBTQ community and defend the SBC's homophobic and hateful rhetoric. The same goes for female pastors. In the original Hebrew, Paul calls on a single church not to ordain a female pastors because the women at that church were partaking in sexual immorality. However, later translations of the Bible would spin this command to all churches, which is why the SBC is strongly against women pastors and even disbanded Saddleback Church, the mega church in California, for ordaining them. Now, even if the original Greek or Hebrew translation strictly condemned these things, I would still not see being gay or ordaining women pastors as an issue. The reason is because I and other Methodists believe that Christianity is progressive, meaning it grows and develops the same way that society does. We think this way because God calls on us to grow in our faiths and grow as believers. So if we're called to progress our faith forward, then why shouldn't the Bible be progressive? That was another issue that also led to me deconstructing. Watching people at my church talk about how we need to grow in our faiths and be childlike in our walk with God never made much sense to me because they continue to believe the same outdated teachings from 2,000 years ago. I think that if the Bible was written today rather than 2,000 years ago, it would have been written way more differently and likely condemned many evangelical stances. Also, just a side note, if your church claims that we as Christians need to have childlike faith, get the fuck out of that place immediately. What they mean is that we need to be stupid and gullible so that we rely on the Bible and religious leaders for all decisions that we make in our lives, which is exactly what cults do. So if your church even says to have childlike faith, run away because you are not in a church, you are in a cult. Just in case you missed the part on the sign that said Baptist Church, which should already be enough to tell you that it's a cult. Another big thing that I've deconstructed is purity culture. So purity culture is a big thing in practically every Christian denomination because sex outside of marriage is considered sinful. Personally, I don't think this is a sin at all, as not only does the Bible not explicitly say you can't have sex outside of marriage, but the entire book of Song of Solomon is literally written about an unmarried couple talking about each other sexually. Even though I said earlier that the Bible is flawed, I don't think the Bible would include an entire book about two unmarried people making love if it claimed that sex outside of marriage is sinful. Now that I think about it, it makes perfect sense as to why this book had never been brought up in the almost 2 decades that I've been attending church, since it completely destroys the purity culture narrative that evangelicals idolize so much. And plus, consensual sex between 2 people doesn't harm anyone or anything. It's not like lying or stealing or other sins that actually harm others. Now, purity culture itself pretty much takes this concept to the extreme, claiming that people should do whatever it takes to not only abstain from sex, but also abstain from anything sexual, from kissing to sexual urges to even being around someone of the opposite gender. In fact, it even tells people to feel guilty about their sexual desires and feelings, even though these are 100% natural and everyone has them. Like, I remember being 12 and having sexual interest with cute girls in my class, which is okay. Every 12-year-old boy dreams about having sex with a cute girl. That's normal. However, I remember immediately feeling guilty whenever I remembered being told that having sex before marriage was evil, and it hurt me so much because it was almost as if purity culture had installed a thought controls in my head to prevent me from even thinking about sexual desires. I thankfully overcame this when I was 17, which is when I finally realized that having sexual urges and interests is perfectly normal and is natural human behavior. Now, alongside suppressing natural human behavior, purity culture is especially harmful to women. You see, my old church and many other Southern Baptist churches preach that a woman's worth is in their virginity. The way my church put it, if a woman was to have sex before marriage, whether that be their choice or against their will, she was impure and lost all of her worth. Additionally, churches tell women to quote-unquote dress modestly in order to make sure that men don't stumble. Firstly, the dress modestly quote was actually referring to women dressing like they're rich, not dressing in a way that shows a lot of skin. Secondly, to say that this statement is dangerous would be an understatement. Telling women that their worth is in their purity is not biblical whatsoever and is absolutely horrific because it makes women who have had sex prior to marriage feel awful about themselves and only pushes them further from God, as it makes them hate Him for supposedly condemning them rather than towards Him. This is also true of women who've unfortunately been the victims of sexual violence, as rather than condemning the men who've committed these gross and disgusting acts against these women, evangelical churches would rather condemn the women and defend the abuse. Given how evangelical churches don't allow divorce under any circumstances, even in cases of abuse or cheating, you can also start to fit the pieces of the puzzle and see how the SBC defends abuse and treats women worse than pretty much any rap song. I also want to bring up the hypocrisy of people, or the hypocrisy, I always missay that word, the hypocrisy of people who preach purity culture. Back in Sunday school at my old church, it was always the youth members who spoke up the most and condemned sexual sins and other sins than the most that were usually the ones committing them. Like, I remember one girl in Sunday school talk about how our world is sex craved and people need to stop having sex before marriage. But then later that week, I saw a video of her humping a man at a party while drinking alcohol, which she also criticized the week before during Sunday school. And this wasn't the only one, as I see all the time online of people who fiercely propose purity culture do exactly what they condemn. In fact, research has shown that the states with the highest percentage of women who give birth out of wedlock are the states with the most SBC members and supporters. Funny how that works. Now, what solution does the SBC provide for sexual urges? Other than suppressing them, the SBC tells members to get married so that they can have sex without it being sinful. This takes us into the third big thing that I've deconstructed: marriage and family. Now, for the record, I don't exactly have a lot of experience with this topic because I'm single. However, I can still give my thoughts on this issue as a single man because it also affects us singles as well. So in addition to purity culture, evangelical churches also idolize marriage and families. Now, I personally believe that marriage and family are fantastic things and are beautiful. I do, however, believe that these are very important decisions. Some people will of course get married and raise children. Some people will get married and not have children. And some people will not get married at all. It's an important decision that requires a lot of thought put into it. But no matter what decision one makes, there isn't a right or wrong decision, as all three of these choices are perfectly acceptable and valid. However, you'll come to find that the evangelical church strongly disagrees with me on this, as they believe that everyone is required to get married and have kids as soon as possible, and they also expect you to do it when you are very young as well. Often, Christian colleges and universities are criticized and joke about because in their culture, you get married during your freshman year. I noticed this quite a bit as a youth member back at my old church, where former youth members who would go off on to a Christian school, almost always Liberty University, and they'll return and talk about how they're already married and have a kid on the way. Why? Because our church basically treated marriage and having kids as if that was required of us to be Christians. In fact, my church even considered it to be sinful for someone to not marry or be married without kids. That explains why our preacher preached so many sermons about marriage and kids, but not about singles. It's also ironic too because Jesus himself was single. He never had kids, never married, and he was 33 when he was crucified. At that age, my old church would be deeply questioning members who were still single and even assume that they were sexually immoral. The same goes for Paul, who the church hails as a hero. Thankfully, my parents have never pushed marriage or having kids on me, as they've even encouraged me to be single or not have kids if I desire not to. Which I'm glad, since I don't really care for marriage, but I 100% know that I absolutely do not want kids. Marriage and childbearing are important decisions that shouldn't be taken lightly like what the SBC does, and nor should anyone be expected to do these things when they don't want to. I think that this is honestly why the divorce rate in the United States is so high, as couples who aren't ready to get married are persuaded and encouraged by the church to do so. And then they get married and realize that it's not what they want or who they want to be with, and they end up in unhappy marriages. I think that if the SBC stopped idolizing these things and made it more about making a decision, divorce rates would drastically decrease, and we could focus more on maintaining stable and happy families. Now, even though I've been talking about the married side for a little bit, I also want to bring up the single side. So as you'll come to know, we singles are pretty much forgotten about by the church. This isn't exactly an SBC or an evangelical issue, as I even noticed this issue at my more liberal-leaning Methodist church, as it's an issue prevalent in all denominations. Being single in church is awkward, and the reason is because churches tend to forget about us. Like, they have Awanas for kids, and then youth for teens, then college and young adult Sunday school groups for those aged 18 and 24. But then it jumps to married couples and groups, and then old people groups. You'll notice that after college and young adult groups, there's no singles group. Now, thankfully, I haven't reached that age yet since I'm only 19, but you'll come to find that churches aren't very equipped to serve single men and women over the age of 25, since they usually expect them to be married by then. However, I think that in the future, this is going to change for more liberal-leaning denominations like Methodists and Episcopalians, as single people now outnumber married people, and as these more progressive denominations look at who they aren't reaching, they're going to quickly discover that young adults and singles have tons of potential to be served. I don't think single or young adults necessarily hate Christianity like what my old SBC church claimed. They just hate being told that you must follow all these outdated and derogatory rules set forth by old and out-of-touch people just to appease God. And given Methodists' more follow God approach rather than their legalist or fundamentalist approach, I think they're going to soon try to market towards singles and start to provide more services for singles. They did it with LGBTQ Christians, and it worked perfectly. So maybe this issue won't be as bad in a few years as it is right now. Fourth issue that I've deconstructed is the fear of being worldly. Worldly is a word the evangelicals use to describe things that don't align with the Bible, or in other words, stuff evangelicals don't understand, so they immediately assume it's satanic. If you're old enough to remember the satanic panic back in the 80s, you might recall metal being considered Satan, with churches claiming bands like Metallica and Iron Maiden are worshiping Satan. Of course, these were complete bullshit claims that just showed how uneducated the church was. Like, my old church still to this day claims that Iron Maiden's The Number of the Beast portrays Satan as a hero when it actually does quite the opposite. I always find it funny to think about what they think about my music, since what they would think about my music. Since if they think Iron Maiden and any other mainstream bands are quote-unquote satanic, it would be hilarious to think about what they think about Powerwolf, my favorite band, as well as a band that literally mocks Jesus and God in their songs and praises the devil. I'm sure they think twice about calling just any band satanic after they listen to songs like Resurrection by Erection or Saint Satan's Day. Now, the SBC also says the same thing about literally every song and music artist that isn't Christian or country music, since they've claimed that those are the only two genres are the only genres of music that Christians should be listening to. Ironically enough, those are my two least favorite genres of music, as I think Christian music for the most part is very cringy, and as a white-collared man from Charlotte, fuck country music. I'd rather never listen to music again than only be allowed to listen to these two genres. Now, music isn't the only worldly thing they criticize, as evangelicals also call pretty much anything they don't like as demonic. For example, back when Harry Potter first came out, churches were quick to call it satanic because it endorsed witchcraft, which I already pointed out doesn't exist. Churches strictly forbid anyone from reading Harry Potter and called it pure evil. The same went with Pokemon too, as churches complained about the evolution mechanic and said that the creator was trying to make kids believe in evolution. Again, completely ridiculous and stubborn beliefs held by the SBC. Now, being worldly can also involve just acting like people who don't go to church. So this could be things like going to a party, drinking alcohol, that stuff. Even though I don't engage in any of this stuff myself, I don't really think there's anything wrong with Christians going to parties or drinking alcohol as long as they don't value it more than Christ. And of course, like purity culture, what's so funny about all this is that it's always the same motherfuckers who talk about how Christians can't party or drink alcohol that do exactly those things. But moving on from actions, let's talk about the actual things that made me think the SBC is a cult. So I consistently heard sermons as a Baptist about how we need to be different from the world and show it. One way they said that we could do this is by avoiding anything or anyone worldly. What they meant by that was only hanging out around Baptists and only associating with them. I remember so many times back in youth being told that we should only be friends with other Christians, and that being friends with non-Christians or even non-Baptists would turn us away from God. In fact, a Sunday school teacher even said that non-Christian friends were not real friends because they weren't our brothers or sisters in Christ, as only Christians could be our real friends. Very ironic that he said that, since the vast majority of fake friends I've ever had were Christians. It was those quote-unquote real friends he mentioned that left me out and made fun of me for it at Fuge. And ironically enough, very few of my non-religious and non-SBC affiliated friends are fake, as they've all been fantastic and down-to-earth people, unlike my friends at my old church who backstabbed me. Now, the reason I say that is that cult-like behavior is because cults often restrict members to only interacting and hanging out with other cult members. And the SBC tells members to do just that. So if you ask me, I think the SBC is a cult by just that alone. It include all the other stuff as telling people what to wear, where to go, and how to live their lives, and the only furthers my point that they're a cult. Fifth thing that I've deconstructed is baptism. Now, Baptists do baptism a lot more differently than other denominations, as they do not baptize babies or anyone until they give their life to Christ This is why I wasn't baptized until a month before I turned 14, rather than as a baby. They also strictly only allow baptism by immersion, which is when the person being baptized is pretty much dunked into a pool of water. They only allow this method because that's how Jesus was baptized. Personally, I don't really have an issue with this style of baptism, as I could definitely get behind the more biblical method of baptism and wait until one is ready to make a decision. However, I do have an issue of waiting until someone makes a decision, and I'll mention why in a bit. Now, Methodists and pretty much every other denomination, on the other hand, does baptism much differently, as we baptize babies more as a way to welcome them in the world and into the life in general, and basically bless them in hopes that when they are old enough, they'll make a decision. We also baptize new members of the church too, but mostly babies. We also baptize differently, as rather than dunking them into water, the pastor will put his or her finger into a plate of water and then sprinkle the head of the one being baptized. They will then take a little walk around the sanctuary with the baptized individual, showing them the church family and basically showing them what they have to look forward to. If the baptized person is a baby, then when the baby grows up and starts 6th grade, they'll take a class on what it means to give your life to Christ and dive deep into what that actually means. Obviously, we don't do baptism by immersion on babies because that would be child abuse, so that's why we instead sprinkle their head. We also do this method for adults too. Personally, I can also get behind this form of baptism, as instead of being treated as a confession of faith, it's treated more like as a good luck charm and a feeling of ambiguity, which is especially exciting when we're talking about babies and what they'll do when they are older, as well as for adults who have a new life to look forward to and eternal life in heaven. Now, as for my personal thoughts on which baptism is the correct one, I honestly think both the SBC and non-SBC methods are fine. I also don't think one is inherently better than the other, as baptism is baptism, whether it be by immersion or sprinkling or on babies. It's baptism. Personally though, I don't even think baptism is inherently that significant, as it doesn't get you saved or make you a good Christian. Like, look at me. I was baptized and I'm the worst fucking Christian to ever live. But the reason baptism isn't all that significant is because God doesn't really care if you've been dunked in water or sprinkled as a baby. He cares more about your heart and if you have a relationship with Him, as that's what gets you into heaven, not baptism. However, I do also have an issue with how Southern Baptists do baptism, and that's the fact that the vast majority of people that they baptize are young children, usually between the ages of 6 and 8. In fact, me and Zoe were far older than almost everyone in terms of ages when we were baptized, as I was of course 13 when I was baptized, while Zoe was 14 when she was baptized. Our parents made it very clear to us that accepting God was a personal decision, and that nobody could make the decision for us, which is why we both were teens when we made that decision, since as kids, we knew that we didn't really understand what it meant to give our lives to Christ, and knew that it was very important decisions. That brings me as to why I think that this is an issue with so many young children being baptized, as I don't think that these kids understand the decision that they're making. When I was 8 years old, I didn't know what it meant to trust God. Hell, I didn't even know what it meant when I was 11. So I don't think that as these kids who are being baptized at 7 or 8 years old really know what they're getting themselves into. I feel that many of them aren't actually making a decision to follow God because they wanted to make the decision, but rather because their parents or Sunday school teacher wanted them. Now, I might be sounding like a hypocrite because I don't have a problem with infant baptism, but the reason is because infant baptism and evangelical baptisms have two different purposes. Infant baptism is to welcome babies into the church and to bless them, while evangelical baptism is a confession of faith. That's why I'm holding evangelical baptism to a different standard, since they treat baptism differently. And given how many young kids are being baptized who very likely don't understand what they're doing, it's clear that the SBC only cares about numbers and baptisms rather than the members actually being saved. That's also why I really like the Methodist way of having members take a class about being saved and what it truly means, as that teaches people what they're getting themselves into and why it's such an important decision. A sixth thing that I'll talk about with regards to what I've deconstructed deals with influences. More specifically, the church's public image. So the SBC and other Baptist churches are very often stereotyped as being Bible-thumping conservative churches with pastors who love yelling at their congregations and enjoy condemning people to hell. Unfortunately, this stereotype is in fact true, as pretty much every SBC church has a pastor who yells constantly and loves talking about the people who are going to hell, almost as if they enjoy talking about sending people to hell. Like when I was a kid, if you asked me to describe a preacher, I would probably describe a man who yells all the time and is super mean. And I would be very accurate with that description, as Southern Baptist pastors are very, very mean. No normal Christian enjoys condemning people to hell. In fact, most Christians don't even believe in hell at all. I'm personally on the fence about it, but I could still see myself agreeing with both sides regarding hell. But to enjoy telling people that they're going to hell because they do something that goes against a flawed ancient piece of text that is absolutely cruel and psychopathic, as even if hell does exist, God himself probably doesn't enjoy watching people go to hell. So why do Southern Baptist preachers enjoy talking about it so much? Well, the reason has to do with the hate that is in their hearts. Southern Baptists are especially hateful towards minorities, often targeted groups, and really anyone that isn't like them. I already talked about homosexuals and how Southern Baptists view them as abominations. Not because the Bible says so, but because they're just homosexuals. They just hate homosexuals. So it makes sense why the Baptist preachers often enjoy condemning them and other groups of people they don't like to hell, because it makes them feel good about themselves. That's some crazy self-desire and selfishness for a group of people who claim not having kids is selfish. Meanwhile, Methodists have a much better reputation than just a simple decency for other people. I've never even heard my pastor talk about hell, let alone condemn someone to hell. And I think that's how it should work, as hell is a very scary place and can be very insensitive to many people, especially children. As a kid, I was absolutely terrified of dying because I was told that I would go to hell since I wasn't saved, which I think might also explain why so many young children get baptized. I had many nightmares as a kid about hell and being sent there, causing me quite a bit of anxiety and unnecessary stress. You can also reference to the Bible for this too. If you read through the Gospels, you'll notice that hell isn't talked about that much. That's because God doesn't want us to focus on hell. He wants us to focus on heaven. Again, I don't even know if hell exists, as I've lately been questioning its sheer existence, but I know that if it does exist, then I'm sure God would much rather us talk more about heaven rather than hell. And that's what we do as Methodists, as we talk a whole lot more about heaven and God's grace over all the torture and gnashing of teeth bullshit that Southern Baptists love preaching about so much. Going back to the public image issue, Methodists also have a better public image and history than Southern Baptists. Looking at research surveys done over the years, Methodists are for the most part, more liked and respected by both other denominations and non-Christians except for Southern Baptists, who absolutely hate us because, well, we aren't them. This also makes sense as to why at the beginning of each Sunday morning worship session, our pastor has us pray for a non-Methodist affiliated church in the general area, since we respect other denominations and work closely with them, unlike Southern Baptists who want to cause division and criticize anyone not like them. In fact, I've never heard any other denomination at my new church be talked about negatively, not even the SBC. Meanwhile, the SBC is by far the most hated of every denomination alongside Jehovah's Witnesses. And as a former Southern Baptist, I completely understand why, since the SBC is more focused on turning people away from God than turning people towards God. A seventh thing I want to mention is victim complex. So my church, especially in youth, would discuss Christian persecution and how the world hates us. They would often make the claim that Christians are persecuted in the United States and how the world hates us. Now, don't get me wrong, Christian persecution does exist. In many countries, especially in the Middle East, just simply being a Christian is enough to have you beheaded, stoned to death, or worse. I remember a missionary who visited us at Refuge who did missionary work in Jakarta, Indonesia, and the fact that he lived pretty much every day with the risk of being put to death for his faith sounded really scary. However, Christian persecution in the United States is literally a complete joke compared to the persecution seen in Indonesia or the Middle East. You see, when my church was talking about Christian persecution, they were talking about completely bullshit and petty things like prayer not being in schools, people openly criticizing the church, and the worst thing that ever happened to Christians, being told Merry Xmas. In fact, I'm sure if my old church watched the Storytime, they'd accuse me of persecuting them for literally calling them out on their bullshit. This issue is definitely the one that pisses me off the most, because it completely softens real Christian persecution. There are literally Christians in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Yemen, Kuwait, and Syria who are fucking dying for simply being Christians. But yet my old church and the rest of the SBC calls persecution on some of the most petty and ridiculous things like being told Merry Xmas. I also want to mention the church being criticized as well. As mentioned, my old church would claim that they were being persecuted whenever their church was criticized or called out. However, their main defense was quoting the part of scripture where Jesus said, "They will hate you just as they hate me," to which they would say that people hate the church because they hate God. But after further questioning this piece of scripture and finding another piece that says Christians need to focus on the public image, I've come to the conclusion that the SBC and other evangelical churches aren't hated because people hate Jesus, it's because of the things the church itself does. I particularly noticed this flaw in my old church's claims by talking to non-Christians, most of whom had very positive views of Jesus, citing him as a wonderful man who pitied the poor and called out religious leaders. However, the vast majority of them have very negative views of Christians, often talk about how they try to shove religion down everyone's throat and continue to support this and defend outdated and out-of-touch beliefs. In fact, Mahatma Gandhi even put it very well with regards to Christians, saying, "I like your Christ, I do not like your Christians." So the church isn't hated because of who they believe in, like they would claim, it's actually because of what they believe in and how they force it onto others. One last thing that I want to discuss that I've deconstructed is the rapture. So the rapture is a belief among evangelical Christians that when the end times begin, aka the events of the book of Revelation, God is going to bring up all Christians to heaven and leave anyone not saved behind. This absolutely terrified me as a kid, because I was always worried that I would be left behind if the rapture was to happen, and mom and dad would go away. In fact, whenever I couldn't find my parents, I'd sometimes get really scared that the rapture happened. However, as I've deconstructed, I've questioned the legitimacy of the rapture, as it's never brought up or mentioned in the Bible. After further research and realizing that no other denomination believes in it, I've come to realize that the rapture is not only unbiblical, but it's a complete hoax. Apparently the rapture was thought of back in the 1800s by a man with brain damage, and later adopted by the SBC. This means that if you were to ask members of the early church during, let's say, 50 AD about it, they would have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Of course, you can make an argument that Revelation was written in 90 AD, but if we were to ask members of the church, let's say in the 17th century when the King James Bible was written, they'd still be confused as fuck. And of course, the movies don't help either, often being false and dangerous interpretations of the end times. Left Behind especially shows this, as that movie is what made me so scared of the rapture as a kid. So seeing that evangelicals would blindly follow some crazy man with no idea what he was talking about, or a movie, says a lot about their ideology and who they followed. But even though I've told myself time and time again, I still often fear the rapture. If it was to hypothetically happen, I'd be taken up in heaven since I'm a believer. However, I would be leaving behind so many people as well as my cat. My cat, who is pretty much my child at this point, would probably act the same way as a child would if their parents were raptured. While he would be able to handle that since he's used to me not being home often for college, my parents or Zoe would not be able to take care of him, and he'd be on his own. The same thing would go for young kids whose parents would be raptured up. They'd be terrified as hell because they wouldn't really know what to do. Because they aren't cared for, they're likely to die from neglect. Is that how we should view God, the divine being that's willing to kill millions of children? Seems like evangelicals view him as such, which contradicts their claim that he's a loving God. But with that said, that pretty much wraps up the things that I've deconstructed. Deconstruction has not been very easy, as I've continuously questioned intensely every aspect of my now former beliefs, and it's been tough since it's what I grew up believing. Growing up, I was told that SBC was the only right denomination, that the Bible is 100% true, don't question the legitimacy of the Bible or any other religious texts or figures, and hate all sinners. But as I grew older, especially after being treated terribly by the same people telling me how I must live my life, as well as learning how to think critically and reading the Bible and learning how Jesus lived and how he acted, I've come to realize that the things that I was told as a kid were not only false, but hateful and dangerous. And now as someone who's completely left the evangelical cult, I want to bring awareness about the SBC and all the horrors it preaches to its victims. I hope that after watching this story time, you now understand what the SBC shoves down its members' throats, and the obnoxious and dangerous things that they preach. So yeah, that's all I got for the story time. Thank you all so much for watching this story time, and I'll catch you all on Storytime 59 whenever I decide to upload.